No way, Frederick. I hope you don't mean it. He's a total disaster. Just look at him. Chief Commander Li Yong and Commander Stotsky were looking at the screen, where the image of the red-haired, wiry young man with a face covered with freckles and a completely childish expression of piercing blue eyes was looking back at them. Ensign Wiseman did look a little strange. One might say very unmilitary, even though he was in uniform. However, it hung on him like an old rag. It was absolutely incomprehensible how Ensign Wiseman managed to look curly, even despite the strict Navy grooming standards. But he managed to do it nevertheless. "I'll tell you more, Sonny," Stotsky said calmly. "Not only does he look like a knucklehead, he acts like one. He's always whistling and humming and even carries around a little clipboard where he writes musical notes from time to time." "Notes?" Stotsky nodded. "Exactly. The guy is obsessed with composing music. To tell you the truth, if our situation weren't so desperate, I'd discharge him from the service in no time or transfer him to the Admiralty Parade Orchestra. But you know better than me where we're heading, and that would be straight into hell. This scruffy-looking fellow is the best courier in Gamma Sector, maybe even in the whole fleet." Li Yong stared at the screen incredulously. "No way," he finally said. "You know, Frederick, I'm not the most zealous advocate of discipline and regulations, but this," he nodded at the ensign's picture, "is beyond anything. Are you sure you're not mistaken?" 100%. Stotsky grinned. 26 flights through the hottest zone and not a single scratch. It's as if the Nelians are avoiding him, like he is charmed or something. Li Yong shook his head. It had been 11 years since the Earth Federation had been involved in a desperate war against the Nelians. The Allies were next to useless. None of them could match the Federation in battle fleet strength. Supplies, repair bases, and auxiliary personnel. But the main burden of the war was carried by the Federation fleet. The humans were the most scientifically and technologically advanced race in the Federation and in the local sector of the galaxy. But it was not enough. No one had declared war. No one had negotiated. Everything started suddenly. In distant areas on the outskirts of the Federation, the ships suddenly began to disappear in numbers. All sorts of ships. Scientific and exploration expeditions to promising new systems, colonization arcs, cargo freighters, private yachts, customs corvettes. The Federation had no military fleet then, only a few ships that could be conventionally used as warships because they had relatively powerful armaments. But in reality, they were just large customs ships chasing a few smugglers. No one had believed in interstellar warfare for a long time because of the complete absence of a hypothetical adversary. And now, the enemy had appeared. The worst did not happen. The planets were left untouched by the Nelians, and the people living at the bottom of the gravity well could feel safe. However, they destroyed any artificial object in space, whether a ship, a mining station in the asteroid belt, or even a geostationary communications satellite. Giant multi-kilometer carcasses of Nelian ships that looked like giant clusters of cybernetic polyps from some sick cyber nightmare would drop out of hyperspace and unleash swarms of smaller ships that would sweep through the next system they hit, completely clearing it of any artificial structures, and then just as suddenly disappear. If the system's defenses managed to damage a few attacking ships, the hit ships suffered the same fate. Their companions, if only they could be called that, finished them off and absorbed them. The Nelians did not make contact. No one had succeeded in capturing any of the Nelian ships yet. Little was known about them, and they were named after the remote sector of the galaxy where they had first appeared. No one had ever seen a single Nelian, as no one had ever managed to capture a partially damaged ship. All ships that were hit were either consumed by other Nelians or exploded into a ball of plasma. So nobody had the slightest clue about the location of home planets, if any, or the biological features of the Nelians as a species, if those features were biological. Some emotional reporters called them locusts of space, but even that colorful definition was inaccurate. Locusts leave behind a desert, and the Nelians completely ignore the planets. Galactic civilization was rapidly collapsing, not just because the Nelians had caused all trade, migration, and colonization processes to collapse. After all, the vast majority of planets were quite capable of providing themselves with everything they needed for a trouble-free existence. The problem was broader than that. In addition to physically destroying all means of interstellar and interplanetary travel, the Nelians also made hyperlinks impossible. Unlike Earth's means of communication, which used certain narrow bands of the hyperspace grid to transmit instant messages, the Nelians' messages rolled through this degenerate space like giant tsunami waves, swallowing everything and everyone in their path. These rumblings gradually subsided with distance, but the areas of space occupied by the Nelians were completely cut off from the galactic info network, bounded by the light-speed trap. In such a situation, courier service was the only way to exchange information. Chief Commander Nelian sighed. In a large-scale interstellar war, communicating via couriers was like trying to command a 21st-century tank army by sending orders with carrier pigeons. While information traveled through the hypergrid instantaneously, material objects possessed mass, which inevitably entailed the time factor. Yes, ships traveled many times faster than the speed of light. But what good was a message that came 2 weeks after the Nelians swarmed into the next space sector? By the time the message got through and the strike force arrived on the scene, the Nelians would have had time to do their evil deed or, at the very least, to pull up their reserves. But there was no choice. The defense was supported by guys like this Wiseman, piloting small ships, snooping between sectors, swarming with Nelians, and delivering the most important asset: information. You can't fight a war if you don't know where the enemy is and what his forces are. Couriers died by the dozens and hundreds, but new desperate daredevils took their place, or complete weirdos like Wiseman. Only a truly brave or slightly, or maybe not slightly, insane person would go to serve in the courier service. Wiseman clearly belonged to the second category. "So what do we do?" Stotsky asked. "We have to decide something. Time is ticking. Wiseman has the best record, but if he does not suit you, the next candidate—" "I agree," Nelian interrupted him. "A crazy suicide mission needs a psycho. Wiseman is the perfect candidate." "I will be straightforward, Ensign. This mission is extremely dangerous," said Nelian, looking at Wiseman. The young man had clearly tried to put his appearance in a semblance of order before facing his superiors. A semblance he had succeeded. Curls were still stuck in different directions, and the uniform clearly needed cleaning and ironing. However, couriers were usually forgiven for such deviations from the statutory appearance. Suicide bombers are forgiven a lot of things. Unfortunately, we don't have the luxury of recruiting volunteers. We need the best courier for the mission, so you're going. "Sir, yes, sir." Wiseman almost got it right. Only a dreamy expression of light eyes and a wandering smile on his lips interfered. "This is no ordinary courier trip, Ensign," said Nelian. "By the way, stand at ease. You're almost there anyway. As it goes, you're not going to fly your ship." "Pardon me, sir?" Wiseman relaxed a little, though Nelian suspected that the ensign was not too tense from the start, but rather annoyed at being distracted from his musical notes. "Permission to make an observation, sir?" "Of course. You're the most experienced courier in Gamma Sector. Your opinion could be mission critical. Go ahead." "Sir, if I may be allowed to object, I see no point in changing ships, sir. My Cricket is the fastest version of the scout ship, and I'm used to it, sir. Leung glanced over at Stotsky. He knew that pilots of courier ships usually gave their scouts names. Officially, scouts were identified only by a code of letters and numbers. But Cricket? Stotsky shrugged, hiding a smile. Wiseman's scout was listed as CR1KT, but he couldn't explain that to the captain now. There is a point, Ensign, Stotsky said, taking the initiative. The thing is that this time, you have to deliver more than just information. You'll be flying a small freighter with cargo. Sir? There's an epidemic on Shengol 5, Leung said. Ausvan fever. Apparently, it was brought in by refugees from the orbital cities that flooded the planet when the Nelians arrived in the Shengol system. The problem was that unlike the orbitals, the Shengolans had no immunity, and there were no facilities or raw materials on the planet to produce the vaccine. Everything was on the orbitals. Wiseman stood in front of the officers, and his gaze still wandered absent-mindedly somewhere in the unknown distances, only occasionally lingering on Leung or Stotsky, but the chief commander noticed that the smile disappeared from the ensign's lips. The courier delivered the information 2 days ago, Leung said. The only one of the 10 couriers who managed to get through. Unfortunately, he died of acute radiation sickness after only 24 hours. The Nelians fired a salvo at him before he went into hyperspace. Wiseman woke up. Sir, may I ask who, sir? Leung closed his eyes for a moment. It was Lieutenant Schuster. Did you two know each other? A little, sir. Wiseman sighed faintly. We started out together in the Epsilon sector. We didn't get along very well, sir. Lieutenant Schuster thought that my hobbies were nonsense, sir. But he was a good courier, sir. There was an awkward pause, which Leung finally broke. Loading and launch preparations are underway. Additional advanced engines have been installed on this freighter. Hopefully, that will help. We launch tomorrow at 1600 base time. Wiseman stared perplexed at Leung. Sir, I'm sorry, sir. Leung stood up and looked the ensign straight in the eye. Yes, ensign, we are. I'm going with you. My family lives on Shengol. Hyperspace is a strange thing. The few scientists who claimed to have figured out what it was never really managed to explain exactly what they had figured out to the rest of humanity. However, using their formulas, people were able to build instant communication devices and then engines capable of entering hyperspace and moving in it. Unfortunately, the automation in hyperspace could not be relied on. The fluctuations of the hypercontinuum, little understood by all but a few scientists, sometimes drove the automatics crazy. Only a human could bring it back to normal. Now that many areas of normal space were under the control of the Nelians, the pilot's skill became extremely important. In hyperspace, combat was impossible, as each object entering it became a separate closed mini-universe, isolated from everything but the environment's fluctuations. But nothing prevented fleets from controlling key exit points from the hypercontinuum and attacking any object that fell out of them. Admittedly, the Nelians seemed to ignore such a tactical ploy, even after the Federation fleet had caught them in such ambushes a couple times, and inflicted significant damage on the invasion fleets. Once in the new system, the Nelians simply spread out like a swarm of voracious insects, destroying all the objects of artificial origin built over the centuries around the long-established stars. Locusts of space, indeed. The journey to the Shengol system took 11 days. Leung spent this time carefully studying the location of the Nelian forces in the system, though he realized the apparent pointlessness of his task. Surely, the Nelians would not obligingly stick around in the same place to make it easier for humans to bypass the Leviathan ships and destroy the smaller ones. Not counting a few episodes with countering the fluctuations, Wiseman was immersed in his music. He glanced only briefly at the Shengol disposition, pretending to leave it to the senior officer to handle such a strategically important matter. It was evident to Li Yong that Wiseman was more interested in tapping away at his keyboard, putting on headphones, and typing lines of notes into his tablet one after another than in making grand plans for a single freighter's military campaign against the invasion fleet. They'd either get through or they wouldn't. The life of the courier was as simple as that. They hardly spoke to each other. However, on the 8th day, Li Yong could not stand it. "Ensign, tell me, how did you end up in the courier service in the first place?" he asked Wiseman, taking a moment when the young man was not busy in the deckhouse or with his symphony or whatever he was composing. They were both sitting in the wardroom, Wiseman reading a book, Li Yong looking through last disposition intel in his officer's clipboard. Li Yong felt very strange on the ship. On the one hand, he was formally Wiseman's senior officer and commander, and on the other hand, Wiseman was perfectly capable of handling the few duties himself, especially since Li Yong did not know much about the intricacies of the courier service. This ambiguity was so confusing that Li Yong even began to behave not like an officer, but more like a typical civilian specialist, loitering around and pestering the crew with silly questions. This was both amusing and discouraging. Wiseman did not answer immediately, and Li Yong wanted to repeat his question, but then the ensign spoke. "I was graduating from the Colden Conservatory when the Nelians came into the system," he said, staring at the wall. "It's a family tradition. For generations, all the Wisemans have been involved in music in one way or another. The conservatory is in the main city on the planet, so it wasn't threatened. It was already known then that the Nelians didn't touch planets. But my parents were on a tour of old mining orbital cities in the asteroid belt." Li Yong noticed that the ensign's speech was missing all the statutory language, but he didn't care at the moment. They were right in that sector where the Nelians had come from. He was silent for a moment, rubbing his forehead. While the Nelians were cleaning up the outer stations and the belt, several liners had left the system. I managed to get a seat on one of them, and when the liner arrived in the Seal system, I went straight to the nearest recruiting station. He smiled a strange, creepy smile, more like a grin. "You could say I took advantage of my parents' deaths to escape from home." "And you got into the courier service right away?" Li Yong asked. "Not exactly. After the academy, I first served on the destroyer Danube. But then we were ambushed along with the entire 6th Fleet in the Sannon system. I think you know the story. The Nelians hit the bridge with a gravitational gun, and all the officers were killed. I was the only one left who could pilot the ship." "So it was you." The bulletin mentioned some young graduate who saved the destroyer without mentioning his name. Li Yong strained his memory. "I think your bearing was followed by 3 other ships, including the last surviving cruiser." "Yes, sir." Wiseman's clear by-the-book answer was filled with endless fatigue and sadness. "And then I ended up in counterintelligence." "Where?" Wiseman smiled unhappily. "In counterintelligence. That's why my name was not in the bulletin. They found it very suspicious that some fresh product of the accelerated training program managed to pull the remnants of the fleet out of the meat grinder right through the thick of the Nelian armada. They suggested that I might be a Nelian agent." Li Yong shook his head dumbfoundedly. "What a total crap. So far, we don't know of a single case that even remotely hints at the use of infiltration agents by the Nelians. We're not even sure if they can grasp the concept." "Well, it didn't seem that way to them at the time. I was interrogated for 6 months by various, methods." Leung looked sympathetically at the ensign. Although the commander represented the other half of the same department, he disliked counterintelligence officers primarily for their choice of methods. He understood that in times of war, there was no choice, and intelligence was not a kindergarten by any means, but he could not help himself. At least, in this war, the Navy had to deal only with ships and fleets. Anyway, in the end, they gave up and let me out, removing all suspicion, said Wiseman. They still didn't believe me about how I led the ships out of the ambush, though. Their psychiatrist decided it was post-traumatic hallucinations from stress and tension. Leung, immersed in the philosophical aspects of military intelligence and counterintelligence, almost missed Wiseman's words. However, before they finally slipped out of short-term memory, he caught the phrase by the tail. "I'm sorry, I thought I misheard you," said Leung, while his thoughts still flowed in the same direction. Counterintelligence psychiatrist. Yeah, a brain butcher, that's what he is, not a psychiatrist. A way to get through the Nelian fleet? Yeah. Wiseman casually nodded his head, as if they were discussing the evening meal. The way I came out of the Sanon system. Leung realized that he might have staggered and fallen if he hadn't been sitting. Or was the counterintelligence brainiac right, and the poor, crazy ensign had been shoved into the courier service so that he would disappear there quickly and out of sight? "So how?" asked the commander. "Very simple," said Wiseman. "I just listened to their music." The Shengol system was swarming with Nelians. One of the older Federation worlds, it was initially settled in reverse order. The first colonizers were anarchists and nonconformists from the Oort cloud of the solar system, who of course immediately began to reproduce the usual way of life. Orbital cities, mining confederations of hundreds of settlements on asteroids and small satellites, even nomadic communities on slowly expanding giant platforms with geosector engines. Shengol 5 itself has long been preserved solely as a nature reserve and resort. Its population started to grow quickly only a couple of centuries ago. The system was a perfect target for the Nelians. The freighter came out of hyperspace near the orbit of the seventh planet, a gas giant with the usual bunch of satellites and a couple of rings. According to calculations, this point was as far away as possible from all clusters of Nelian ships, although it did not guarantee safety. The Nelians always thoroughly controlled the space of the systems they occupied, not missing any artificial objects. If they were few, a powerful fleet would probably be able to break through to the planet, but the Shengol system now had at least 50 Nelian Leviathans, twice as many medium-sized ships, and countless small scouts. Only the combined fleet of the entire Federation could deal with such numbers, and that was only with heavy losses. Wiseman moved one earpiece closer to the back of his head and turned to Leung. "From what I've heard, we're safe for now, at least for the next hour," he said. "Then one of the Leviathans will come dangerously close. But I have an idea how to avoid the worst of it. So we have time to talk a little, sir." "Why couldn't anyone else figure out the Nelians' hypersignals?" Leung asked. "The best cryptographers and linguists in the Federation have been working on them, but to no avail. Music, after all, has a structure in it. I can't believe that no one but you could understand it." Instead of answering, Wiseman jabbed his tablet a few times and showed the screen to the captain. "Tell me, sir, what do you see?" Leung looked at it. "Music notation," he said. "Musical notation," Wiseman corrected. "Or rather, a variant of it called Western. I have no clue why. Probably some ancient tradition. But can you read it?" "No, of course not." Leung shook his head. "Symphonies and oratories are your specialty. So you realize you're seeing some meaningful, structured writing, but you don't understand what it means, right?" Yeah. Wiseman took the tablet. Now imagine you're from a race that doesn't know music. Such races do exist. They haven't developed this form of art. Would they be able to reconstruct the sound from a notation? By the way, keep in mind that there were actually several such musical languages, even in our history, and they are pretty different from each other. I think I understand what you mean, Li-Yong said slowly. Although we're dealing with the reverse process here, we have to take someone else's music apart, record it, and then understand what it means. First, you must realize that you are dealing with music, said Wiseman. This is a fundamentally different music, completely alien to the human mind. How many composers and music theorists specializing in alien musical harmonies serve as Navy couriers? What do you think? Li-Yong stared at the ensign. I can give you a hint, Wiseman smiled. Not a single one. You can't know that for sure, Li-Yong said. Fleet personnel records are classified, and even my level of access wouldn't be enough for such a request. I didn't request it, Wiseman said. But I know all the top alien music specialists, and the last time I checked, none of them were in the Navy. So you were able to crack the Nelian codes? Li-Yong asked. I can't believe counterintelligence didn't bother to check that claim. With their professional paranoia. Wiseman shook his head sadly. They didn't believe a single word I said, especially since I didn't decipher anything. I just listened to the music and followed it. You know, like a jazz musician picking up a theme from another jazz musician. Only it's more complicated, because I don't really know the theme or the notes. How do you explain that to counterintelligence? It was easier for them to believe I was either a spy or crazy. Besides, I can't teach it. I've tried it with some of the other couriers. All they hear is noise. I guess you need a very good musical ear for this. A perfect one, Li-Yong clarified. Wiseman blushed. I wouldn't put it that way, sir, but yes. Here, listen for yourself. He switched the hyperwave signals converted to sound to the deckhouse warning speakers. Li-Yong endured precisely 3 seconds, after which a monstrous infernal cacophony made him bend over, clamping his ears. The Wiseman immediately turned off the sound. Oh dear, the commander moaned. And you hear music in this? It's some kind of Trumpets of Doom, as if all the demons of hell simultaneously pinched their tails and howled in a million throats. Yes, sir. At least I've been able to do it so far, sir. Wiseman looked worriedly at the scanner screen, where several spots flickered, signifying Nelian ships. And from what we've just heard, 2 Leviathans are coming to intercept us. Li-Yong felt an icy chill run down his spine. To intercept? Can we make it? Wiseman put on his headphones and listened to the acoustic nightmare with his eyes closed for 30 seconds, then took them off and checked the scanner screen. I'm sorry, sir. 3 more have joined them. And now we are most definitely not gonna run away. Before the despair that rushed into Li-Yong's soul could drown him in its murky waters, the ensign continued. I've been working on something all this time, sir. It seems like a good time to test it. This freighter has a pretty powerful hyper-transmitter. May I use it? Li-Yong stared at the young man in confusion. What is he talking about now that everything is lost? Perhaps that psychiatrist from counterintelligence was right. All this musical mumbo-jumbo is a post-traumatic delusion, and Wiseman's incredible luck is just a rare coincidence of fortuitous circumstances. Use it for what? Asked Li-Yong without any hope. To broadcast the Trumpets of Doom, of course, said Wiseman seriously. In the Nelian way, I just finished the score. It took a week to get in touch with the base. Only when the last Nelvian Leviathan left the system and stopped clogging the local sector of the hypercontinuum with its roar. Of course, Liung's message was first disbelieved, then disbelieved even more, and finally disbelieved so much that he was told to sit tight and wait for the fleet strike group, which was due to arrive in 8 days. Liung didn't mind since his parents, his older sister, and her husband were not due to be released from quarantine until 4 days later. In the meantime, he was basking in the glory of being the planet's savior, avoiding the dubious honor of being carried in the arms of grateful countrymen as much as he could. On the evening of the 3rd day, he finally escaped from the endless waves of gratitude and visited Wiseman. The ensign was hiding from the glory behind the luxurious but sturdy doors of the presidential suite of the most expensive hotel on the planet. Obviously, he was not yet ready for the theoretical glory of a great composer, even in peacetime, let alone the glory of a war hero. Liung gestured to the Wiseman, who had jumped up, seeing the commander entering the room. "Sit down," he said, "and I suggest we drop the sirs and all that official Navy crap. I'm afraid that we will not be able to return to regular service for a very long time, so we can start to get used to civilian life. My full name is Salvatore Nkelu Liung, but my friends call me Sonny." "Sir, yes, sir." "Oh, sorry." Wiseman shook Liung's hand. "I mean, okay, you can call me Nick." Liung lowered himself into the softly padded chair and stretched his legs with pleasure. Finally. "I never thought that a reception with the Prime Minister of the system could be more tiring than a few hours in the weight room. I was afraid that I would lose an arm and break my back from shaking hands and bowing." Wiseman nodded. "Yes, sir. Oops. Yeah, I agree. But I seem to have been left alone." Liung picked up a bottle of wine from the table and looked at the label. He wasn't a big wine connoisseur, but it looked like this bottle was worth about twice his yearly salary. Pulling the cork out with his teeth, he spit it out onto the floor and took a sip straight from the bottle. "I saved you," he said. "Told them you had to develop a system that would drive the Nelvians out of our sector of the galaxy completely." The wine was wonderful, moderately tart, delicate, sweet, sour, and airy at the same time. He took another sip. "Tomorrow, I'm off to see my family, and then all kinds of inspectors from Fleet HQ are coming in to examine us, so we probably won't have a chance to talk peacefully. So I thought I'd take this opportunity to learn a few things." He took another sip and handed the bottle to Wiseman, but the latter only took one small sip and set the bottle on the table. Liung could see that the ensign felt highly uncomfortable, but he simply could not leave this question unanswered. "Here's what I don't understand, Nick. What could you have told the Nelvians that would make them scatter like cockroaches? One little ship, why don't you just swat it and be done with it? They can't be that stupid, can they?" Wiseman looked thoughtfully out of the window. The view was magnificent, the sunset golden surface of the bay framed by smoky wooded mountains. "As far as I can tell, evolution here on Shengol has never evolved to large life forms," he said. "But you've been to a lot of places, haven't you? Probably even on Earth?" Liung nodded. "Yes. My family tree can be traced back to natives of Southeast Asia and Africa, and I've certainly visited the lands of my ancestors a couple times. Why do you ask?" "There were once such large animals on Earth. Cetaceans," Wiseman said. "Huge by Earth standards, dozens of meters long, and over 100 tons in weight. They were hunted, although the hunting was eventually banned. There was a theory that they might be intelligent, but now we will never know, because they have still gone extinct despite all the bans to protect them. Do you know why?" Liung shook his head, feeling like he was about to figure out where Wiseman was going with this. Huge whales. Nelian leviathans. The parallel was self-explanatory. Humans made too much noise, Wiseman said. They literally flooded the oceans with the rumble and crackle of engines, winches, vibrations of propellers and water turbines. The cetaceans communicated through songs. They couldn't sing in that noise, and they died out. I guess they weren't intelligent after all, at least not in our sense of the term. Leung looked at him dumbfounded. You mean the Nelians? Wiseman shrugged his shoulders. I can't prove it or even state it with much certainty. It just seems that way to me. Think about it. No one has ever seen a Nelian, dead or alive. But that's not true. It's just that we couldn't properly conceptualize what was in front of our eyes. The Leviathans are the Nelians, and their swarms of scouts are just sort of remote Baleens. That's why we don't understand them, just like we didn't understand the whales. And they certainly can't understand us. It is unlikely that a sperm whale could understand what a herring is saying to it, and a blue whale could communicate with plankton on an equal footing. So we're food to them? Wiseman laughed. Humiliating, isn't it? The humans, the dominant civilization in an entire arm of the galaxy, a mighty federation with all our advanced science and technology, are just space plankton to creatures who don't even notice our attempts to resist. I have no doubt that herring and shrimps never wanted to end up in the stomachs of whales either. One thing I don't understand is why the Nelians never touch planets. Maybe they are artificial beings, programmed by someone in the unimaginable past. Leung grabbed the bottle and took a big gulp. What about the war? He asked, trying to find a foothold in this new, overwhelming reality. Wounded whales often sank whaling ships, Wiseman said, and sometimes beached themselves. Maybe their self-detonation is the Nelian version of radical disposal of whalers. Leung nodded slowly. It all sounded utterly unbelievable, but it was perfectly harmonious when you created a coherent picture of what was happening. Speaking of harmony, speaking of music, Leung said, what was that tune you were broadcasting to scare them away? Was it some particularly sophisticated form of their cacophony? Or something you composed yourself? Wiseman blushed. That's a rough part, to be honest. I don't know how I'll explain all this to the people from HQ. The thing is that, well, I have a habit of whistling something while I think. During courier flights, I was always whistling with the microphone on while listening to the songs of the Nelians. I noticed that one tune had a special effect on them, making them keep their distance. So, I turned it around and put it in a Nelian mold. Leung looked at him in surprise. That's it? It's no big deal. Our admirals and generals know nothing about symphonic music. You can tell them anything, and technicians don't care. They'll code whatever they're given. Wiseman blushed even more. That's the problem. I didn't whistle a symphony. What then? Wiseman gave him an embarrassed look. I understand your ancestors were also Christian, just like my family. So, Leung didn't understand anything. Absolutely nothing. Wiseman exhaled sharply, like an unsure man daring to jump from a 10-meter tower into the water. Well, I'm not really religious, but I remember one song that my grandma used to sing. It stuck with me and became a sort of unconscious habit. And he whistled softly.